Hey, good morning, everybody. Happy Saturday morning to you, and hope your weeks went well. I want to talk to you a little bit this morning about stories. Um, so I had an email conversation with my uncle this week, and we were talking a little bit about ancestry, and he was having a conversation with his cousin, and my uncle's in his 70s, and he was having a conversation about their parents and about how what the birth order was of all of the siblings, and they couldn't quite remember. And so my uncle knew that I had done a bunch of work on ancestry.com, and that I'd worked through a lot of the ancestry, and so he wanted to reach out and see if I could remember what the birth order was, or if I knew dates of birth and all of that. And so we had a good conversation. Um, and it kind of makes me reminisce a little bit, because I think about my grandfather and about that generation that's gone at this point. And my uncle sent me a follow-up email yesterday, actually, when he shared an article that he had written for the local paper about my grandfather's life and some of the work that he'd done. My grandfather was primarily a farmer, but he kind of farmed for food, and in order to provide food for the family. But there were other expenses as well, and so he'd held some other jobs. He'd worked on the railroad, and he actually spent 20 years working for the Atlas Cement Company in Northampton. And just the article just kind of talked. It was primarily about the Atlas Cement Company, but it just talked a little bit about his life and about his struggles and his story. And there was one particular story in there where it talked about. Good morning, Estella. There was one particular story in there where it talked about this big snowfall that happened, and there was, school was canceled for a few days, and my grandfather was scheduled to go in and work at the Atlas, and he lived 10 miles away from the Atlas, and the car was not going to be able to make it through the snow. And so my grandfather got his lunch together in his lunch pail and put an extra shirt on, and he walked the 10 miles to work that morning for a late shift. And he actually ended up staying there for a few days, because my grandmother was not able to go and get the car and drive to get him, because the roads were too bad. And for a few days, he worked at the Atlas, and he filled in for the shifts for the men who weren't able to make it during that time. And I just thought that was such a cool story to read, because it revealed my grandfather's character. And just a little bit about him. My grandfather had a third grade education, and he had to drop out actually part of the way through third grade from school. His dad died when he was 10 years old, and he had to start working on the farm and kind of earning his keep. Later, he was part of the group at Normandy that stormed the beach on D-Day, and he fought in World War II, obviously. And then he came home, and he worked on the railroad, and he worked on his farm. He spent 20 years at the Atlas Cement Company. And, when I was young, my grandfather died back in 2004. I was 23 when my grandfather died. But when I was young, I really lacked appreciation for these stories. And, as a lot of people do when they get older, as my grandfather grew older, he would repeat the same stories every time. And I would go and I'd cut his grass every week. And, so, I saw him at least once a week, sometimes more than that. And he lived just down the block. He had lived on a farm. And after my grandmother died in 1993, he moved on the same street, but just on the next block. And I kind of lacked appreciation for the stories, because, you heard the same stories over and over again. And I many times, I hate to confess this, but I was just kind of hoping that the story would be over, because it's the same story that I'd heard. And, I never really thought to ask questions about it and seek more information. And it's a shame, because at this stage of life, I'm 38 now, and that generation is gone. And I really wish that I could get more information about my grandfather. And I wish that I'd had more conversations, and I wish I'd video recorded those conversations so that I had all that stuff documented. But, back then that was something that we didn't really do all that much. We didn't all have video cameras on our phones, and we didn't walk around with recorders in our pockets all day. But it reminds me of something that I've heard Andy Stanley talk about, where he said that everything in our lives basically becomes a story, and things big and small eventually just become stories that we will tell. And we'll tell the story of our growing up, or we'll tell the story of college, or of a career, or of a marriage, or maybe a failed marriage, or of raising children and our successes and failures there. And it could be years, or it could be decades of struggle and effort that all get distilled down into a sentence or a paragraph, and eventually into a short article that ends up in a newspaper that chronicles our lives. And all these things, and the effort and the struggle, it all just gets distilled down into a story. And we'll tell the story of college of, oh, I had a good time and I really wasn't a great student, or I didn't really have such a great time and I ended up doing really well. And we might have a few stories that we tell from college, but we kind of summarize it all down into something that we could tell someone on the elevator as we travel between floors. And it's true of so much of our lives. And I think that could lead us to believe that, oh, well, then maybe life's just not all that important. But I actually believe the opposite. I believe that small things matter because our lives are really just a sum of all of our choices. And our lives are a sum of all of the individual stories that happen in our lives that kind of get compressed and that we tell as the story of our lives. And many times we're tempted to disregard the importance of small things, but small things matter a lot. And, one example that I've heard told is exercise, right? Every day we have a choice of whether or not we're going to get exercise. And the choice to exercise can seem like a small thing, because if I exercise today, it makes virtually no difference to the course of my life and the quality of my life and my health. So I could either exercise today or I could skip exercising today, and it would make virtually no difference over the course of my life. But the cumulative effect of exercise, if I choose to exercise 4 or 5 times a week, that makes a huge difference in my life. And that's true of so many other choices in our lives. The individual choices we make, the individual snap judgments that we make, or choices how we respond to things, those individual choices might seem really small, but the cumulative effect of that makes a huge difference to our lives. And so we have to choose daily, and even kind of on a minute by minute basis, how we're writing our story. And I think so many times it's important to take a step back and evaluate our lives, and sometimes even to get a trusted person's input into our lives and into the stories that we're creating. Because there are at least 2 versions of a story. There's the one that we tell, and there's the one that others will tell about us. And sometimes there can be long versions of this story, there can be short versions of this story, there can be multiple versions of the story, but the lives that we choose to live are going to become stories. And stories have power. If you take a look at through the Gospels, Jesus chose to teach with them because people connect with them, because stories matter to people. And so the questions I want to ask you this morning are, how is your story unfolding? How can you make it better? Is your life consequential? Is your story worth telling? Is your story going to be the good example that people want to live up to? Or is it going to be the cautionary tale that people will tell so that it inspires others to do better? Or is your story one that people will easily forget? And we all have choices that we can make every day where our stories can be the good example, the one that people want to follow, and the one that people look up to and aspire to, the ones that inspire other people. So today, I just want to encourage you to make your story one that matters. Make today matter. Let's choose to live a life of meaning. In every interaction, let's choose to leave a good example for people. Let's choose to leave a positive example where people can look to it and feel like, hey, I can do that too. I can make these little acts of kindness, sometimes great acts of kindness. I can make little sacrifices in my life to pour into other people. Let's choose to make our lives matter with everything that we do. Because I sit here this morning and I think back on a man with a third grade education who made his life matter as a small contributor to a great war, and who chose to walk 10 miles through the snow one day to get to work. And I can tell my kids that story about the struggle of growing up and having to go out and get eggs every day so that you'd have food to eat, and to slaughter pigs and cows. And I can tell my kids that story, and I can look back at pride at my grandfather, who lived as part of the greatest generation, and give them an example. And I really hope that someday my kids can look at my example and can tell my story, and that can be an inspiration to them. Because I hope that my life inspires them the way that Jesus' life inspired us. And so go live your story today. Be Jesus to some people today, and be an inspiration to people. Let me pray with you. Father God, I thank you for the stories that make up the whole Bible, and those stories are alive to us today. And Lord, there are names in the Bible today that we read that we think of negative things when we read because of the things they did. And there are names in the Bible that we think of positive things the way that they did. And in almost every case in the Bible, it's a mixed bag because people are imperfect. But Jesus was perfect, and Jesus gave us the perfect example. And Lord, I ask that you would help us today to make our stories count. We're all in a point in our lives where the story has already started, but the end has not yet been written. And we can make choices, big and small, today that can change how that story ends. And Lord, I just ask for you to help us to make those choices, to make wise choices. Lord, to make our lives be of significance, to make them matter to people, not necessarily because of how important we are, but because the things that we do can point to Jesus, and to live a life of character the way that he lived them. And Lord, help us to do that today. Help us to live lives that inspire, that encourage, that show love. Help us to do great things, even if we're doing small things. In Jesus' name. Marianne, thank you for your kind words. I'm glad that I get a chance to do this. And I hope that this story that I told you today mattered. And I hope you guys all have great days. And we'll see you tomorrow morning on the live stream, kicking off a little before about 9:45, and the service starting at 10. Have a great day.